During the heady days of the Weimar Republic, the decadent nightlife of Berlin was fueled by something a lot stronger than Pilsner. Berlin was awash with drugs, and people of all ages turned to drugs to experiment due to record unemployment. 1 in 3 Germans were unemployed. Cocaine was the number one stimulant, though many also used heroin, while tranquilizers were also taken, especially by those who needed extra stimulation to keep up at the city's many crazed parties. Let's look at this degenerate period and why it is being glamorized by the media today. The rise in drug taking was due to the total erasure of German national resources to some extent. Under the terms of the Treaty of Versailles, signed at the end of the First World War, Germany lost its few overseas colonies as well as some important international trade routes. A cost of 112 billion marks was devoted to paying the so-called debts of other European countries and their globalist bankers. Tea and tobacco supplies dried up almost overnight, and the German economy crashed. Other pick-me-ups were soon readily available in the German market. Almost all drugs, including cocaine and heroin, were legal to buy, and you could buy them on most Berlin streets during the 1920s. Weimar Germany ended up the sole consumer of Peruvian cocaine, while 80% of all the cocaine made by domestic pharmaceuticals was snorted up the nostrils of 4 million Berliners instead of other cities of Germany. Nightclubs and cabarets were also flooded with drugs. In Weimar Berlin, some of the most notorious establishments gave their customers drugs upon entry. This is similar to being handed joints, free drinks, or CBD gummies across American cities today. With Germany still suffering both physically and emotionally from the Great War, countless veterans were being prescribed morphine and even heroin to help them deal with pain. People who hadn't been to the front felt a need to get out of their heads and try and forget the national trauma. Methamphetamine research joined other pharmaceutical research as the one segment of the German economy that wasn't totally bust. In 1938, the German Temmler pharmaceutical company began advertising the sale of their new flagship product, Pervitin. Described as the ultimate pick-me-up, the drug quickly became a sensation, with people praising its performance-enhancing abilities. From housewives to actors, the drug was soon being consumed across all walks of German society at a frequency that would have you believe it was just a regular candy. Aided by the fact Pervitin could be initially purchased without a prescription, the wonder drug became Germany's new addiction. It didn't take long for the drug to seamlessly make its way into the armed forces, a match that would soon be heralded as one made in military heaven. Pervitin combated fatigue, triggered a heightened sense of alert, and renewed the consumer with a fresh wave of motivation and concentration. It allowed people to work for longer hours, and in the world of a soldier where sleep was the enemy, Pervitin became the cure. It also raised self-confidence, giving the consumer a sense of invincibility, which led to an increase in risk-taking. In every which way, the drug provided people with a neuronal firework. At the same time, it dulled feelings of empathy, hunger, thirst, and reduced sensitivity to pain. It was the perfect weapon for turning soldiers into ultimate fighting machines. Otto Ranke, a military doctor and director of the Institute for General and Defense Physiology at Berlin's Academy of Military Medicine, began testing the drug. Although he discovered side effects, he concluded it was an excellent substance for rousing a weary squad, a militarily valuable substance. Pervitin was a powerful methamphetamine, better known today as crystal meth. The end of the First World War left many Germans financially ruined. 1920 saw one of the lowest life expectancies of Germans ever, at just over 40 years old, with drugs ripping through its cities. Many Germans flocked to the big cities in order to try and make a living, as their farms had rusted and their assets had been seized by the government to pay an imposed debt. From 1920 onwards, the size of Berlin grew by a factor of 13. The Greater Berlin Act was passed to expand the land mass of the city, in contrast to politicians today who simply let sprawl happen. Almost overnight, in April 1920, Berlin became a teeming metropolis and a party place for the relative few who could afford it. A loaf of bread cost millions of marks. This was a darker side to the decadence. Many who moved to Berlin and other big cities in search of work struggled to find it. The factories were without leadership, dead sons at the front, tuberculosis killing men and women alike. There wasn't enough housing. Women turned to selling their bodies for rent. This quickly turned to selling their bodies for beer, cigarettes, and even sending their children to cabarets for money. Soon, homosexual and heterosexual sales of the flesh were found on Berlin street corners and run-of-the-mill bars. Ericstrasse was a popular spot for female prostitution. You can still find photographs of these women without any tights or leggings, bare-legged in the cold. Towards the end of the Great War, the German government moved to legalize prostitution and established regional agencies to oversee prostitutes and give them health checks. Nationwide, STD screening was required for all citizens. Since many soldiers had been returning to the front after a few days' leave in the city, suffering the effects of sexually transmitted diseases, the authorities set up legal and approved brothels. But this did not stop illegal and unapproved brothels. The German government cared so little for the German family unit, German soldiers were given coupons to use in legal establishments in the hope that they would at least remain disease-free. Once the war was over, huge numbers of young men moved to the big cities. Journalist Hans Ostwald remarked at the time, "Most dance halls are nothing but markets for prostitution." Many of the dancing girls in the cabaret bars and dance halls could be taken home or just into a back room for money. After the 1929 economic crash and hyperinflation in Germany, there were even instances of mother and daughter teams working together in order to survive. A whole new vocabulary emerged in 1920s Berlin, with specialist words and terms for different girls and different types of prostitution. A man might want to enjoy the company of a half-silk, who was a woman who worked in an office or shop by day and then sold her body on occasional weekends or evenings. This might be synonymous with the SW or OF girls on Reddit and other platforms today. Then there were the Newts, boyish teenage girls who turned tricks after school, or Munsies, heavily pregnant ladies who would wait for clients under lampposts. There was a market for so-called gravel stones, women who didn't fit the accepted definition of beauty. A man could pay for a woman missing limbs, with severe burns or any other deformity. Thanks to the Great War and its industrial bombs, there was no shortage of gravel stones. These unnatural impulses were reflected in magazine art. Men would portray women as filthy and cut up. Artists who depicted serene scenes of the environment or Prussian history were ostracized. When a serial killer attacking women was revealed to be on the scene in the late 1920s, Germans were so wound up about it, a movie was made. And in 1931, another serial killer movie called M, about a man killing children, was made. Gore and violence on screen were commonplace. Prostitution was so accepted it became a tiered structure, sort of like Craigslist back-page ads to the Instagram fashion models for hire today. So-called Fosies advertised their services in German newspapers and magazines, while half-beavers were later ladies of good breeding who worked in high-class brothels during the afternoon or early evenings, but never late at night. But it was in the dance halls and cabarets where things were really crazy. In some establishments, if you booked an expensive table for an evening, a table lady would be included in the price. Almost always the most beautiful girls, and invariably they were also chosen for their cultured demeanor in the venue, these table ladies would be yours for the whole evening. You can learn more about this environment in the highly detailed series Babylon Berlin. It wasn't just women who were turning tricks in Berlin, but men as well. They could be found in Berlin as well as in Hamburg. One contemporary writer noted every high school boy wanted to earn some money, and in the dimly lit bars one might see government officials and men of the world of finance tenderly courting drunken sailors without any shame. As well as selling themselves on the streets, male prostitutes would advertise their services in specialist newspapers and journals. According to one study, as many as 30 homosexual publications could be found on a typical Berlin kiosk at the height of the Weimar Republic from 1918 to 1933. These magazines also featured adverts for private detectives. Many gay men had photos of their johns, and so attempted blackmail was common. There was a huge market for detectives capable of finding out who might be behind blackmailers. Men from across Europe, including Britain and Scandinavia, as well as from Russia, flocked to the German capital to enjoy the company of other men, and they were happy to pay for it. Sexual trafficking across the continent was not uncommon. Some American men also traveled to Berlin and indulged in the city's many vices. The American architect Philip Johnson admitted to using male prostitutes and praised the openness of Berlin during the Weimar years. He and his ugly rectangular modern architecture would go on to head MoMA. Johnson also supported Hitler and right-wing nationalist politics worldwide, including Huey Long, recognizing the need for change after seeing boys selling their bodies on the streets of Berlin. British peer Baron Boothby also visited the Weimar Republic and praised its homosexuality before getting entangled with the Kray twins, who you can learn about on this channel. In the dance halls and cabaret clubs of Weimar Germany, some of the most popular acts were male and female impersonators. Cross-dressing was huge for children and adults, just as pride events today ignore public decency and nudity laws. At almost every Weimar party, you might expect to find women dressed in top hats and tails, which Weimar beauty Marlene Dietrich popularized, or men in cocktail dresses. Cross-dressing was legal in Berlin during the Weimar years, but it was largely restricted to clubs, bars, and other private venues. However, it was hardly a secret phenomenon. In respectable magazines and newspapers, adverts specifically aimed at the cross-dressing community were regularly on display, promising everything from plus-size gowns to wigs to men's-sized heels and other accessories. Cross-dressing prostitutes were also popular, and many were well-known celebrities on the cabaret circuit. They charged huge amounts for their company, sort of like drag queens given TV shows today. Almost from the very start of the Weimar Republic, cross-dressing went from being seen as an unhealthy perversion to something to be understood and celebrated due to the involvement and pressure from so-called scientists. In 1919, the Zionist Dr. Magnus Hirschfeld opened the Institute for Sexual Science. He not only offered to counsel both female and male cross-dressers, but carried out research into this area of human sexuality. He offered hormone injections. He also performed some of the earliest genital mutilation surgeries in the West. FGM had been performed in Muslim and North African communities for decades, but Dr. Hirschfeld brought it to Germany. The Institute for Sexual Science made German society more tolerant of cross-dressers. People were forced to deal with it. The Institute issued transvestite passes to be shown to the police to prove that a person was not perverted or a deviant. These passes rarely worked, because the reality was not everyone in Berlin was so, quote, progressive and understanding as Dr. Hirschfeld and his colleagues. This is where the term progressive really gains its stride. Hirschfeld realized the power of film as propaganda and starred in a gay-friendly film funded in part by the German government called Different from the Others of 1919. His work was reproduced across America on the taxpayer dime, mainly through universities, throughout 2001, and its popularity has increased since then. In 1920s Berlin, no subject was off limits. Both on the stage and in the audience of the biggest dance and cabaret halls, politicians were routinely criticized and ridiculed. When Adolf Hitler emerged onto the political scene, he was routinely mocked. But he wasn't the only one. The left-wing political titan Friedrich Ebert was also subjected to widespread ridicule, though mostly for his weight than for his beliefs and policies which many agreed with. By the mid-1920s, most of the comedians performing on Berlin stages included at least some satire or political observations in their material. Nothing was off limits and nothing was sacred. Bertolt Brecht, arguably Germany's most celebrated man of letters of the time, scandalized Berlin society by reminding the city's partygoers of the grimness of recent history. In January 1922, Brecht performed his Ballad of the Dead Soldier in a popular night spot. It was a tale set in the First World War. In it, the German army, running low on manpower, decides to dig up the body of a dead soldier. They load the deceased young man's body with schnapps and cover it with incense to mask the smell, and then send him back to the front to fight and die all over again. In a city that tolerated drugs and child prostitution, this was an outrage too far due to the large population of veterans living in Berlin. It's almost impossible to find a copy of the play today. Brecht and the Arnold Branen Bertolt Brecht Company would only perform the work for 6 nights before ditching it completely. Brecht was influenced by his Catholic grandmother and his German Jewish father to totally upbraid his Catholic heritage. One of his first plays was named after the demon Baal in 1918. Brecht, like many, used a loophole to avoid conscription in World War I. He enrolled in medical school in 1917, making him exempt. So his understanding of the front was very limited and indirect. His son Frank, however, would understand it and died at the German front lines in 1943. Brecht called his naysayers Nazis, even if they were not, and his plays were considered heavily influential in changing the mood of Berlin. In 1922, while still living in Munich, Brecht came to the attention of an influential Berlin critic, Herbert Ihring. At 24, the writer Bert Brecht has changed Germany's literary complexion overnight. He enthused in his review of Brecht's first play to be produced, Drums in the Night. He has given our time a new tone, a new melody, a new vision. It is a language you can feel on your tongue, in your gums, your ear, your spinal column. Anita Berber was, for many, the epitome of 1920s style. She also epitomized the liberal and experimental nature of the Weimar Republic. To her fans, she was a pioneer. To her detractors, she was presented as evidence that Germany lost its moral compass in the years following the First World War, and her death at the age of just 29 in 1928 was proof the nation needed to clean up its act. Born in Leipzig in 1899, Berber was raised by her grandmother. While her parents may not have been around much since they divorced when she was 4, her father was a top violinist with the municipal orchestra, and her mother was an occasional cabaret singer, so the young Anita did inherit a love of show business from them. She moved to Berlin at the age of 16 with her fellow dancer friend Rita Sachetto, determined to make it as a cabaret dancer like many children who knew no other career. For a couple of years, she danced in cabaret shows, slowly making a name for herself while a model for Die Dame. Androgynous due to her malnourished frame, she wore heavy dancer's makeup, which on the black and white photos and films of the time came across as jet black lipstick, painted across the heart-shaped part of her lips and charcoaled eyes. When the war ended and the Weimar Republic was founded, she really exploded onto the scene. Her dances had names such as cocaine and morphium, and they broke boundaries with their androgyny and total nudity. By the end of 1918, she was dancing in movies too, much to the delight of her growing army of fans. It wasn't just her dress sense that made Berber so shocking, though her short bobbed hair, often painted red, appeared in many fashion shoots. It was her social life. Berber had torrid affairs with artists and actors, both male and female, and married twice. Perhaps due to this, she was a raging alcoholic and rampant drug user. She started each day with a breakfast of chloroform and a bowl of ether with white rose petals dipped in, which she would then eat, and then steadily progressed to cocaine, morphine, and heroin throughout the day. Even though she managed to ditch alcohol altogether by 1928, the damage was done to her immune system, and a few months later she was dead from severe tuberculosis. Weimar Germany had lost its ultimate icon, even if there were plenty of other women determined to take her place. Thanks to her movies such as Prostitution of 1919 and Lucretia Borgia of 1922, as well as the fact she was the muse and model for some of the era's leading artists, including Otto Dix, she remains the poster child of the time. Both adult men and women sold their bodies in the streets and clubs of Berlin, but child prostitutes were also bought and sold here. There was a booming and well-regulated industry of this, with pimps happy to cater to almost any taste, just like the pornography of today. If you knew where to go and, just as importantly, what to ask for, the chances are you could get it, no questions asked. In downtown Berlin, some pharmacists peddled a side trade in child prostitutes. These boys and girls were called medicine. If you knew where to go, you simply told the chemist you wanted some, quote, medicine. You would also tell him how long you had been ill for. This was all part of a not-so-elaborate ruse. If you said you had been ill for 13 years, then the chemist would know you wanted a 13-year-old girl. Similarly, if you requested red pills, he would try and procure a redhead. In most cases, the pharmacist would know exactly where to take a prospective client and would deliver him to the appropriate club or apartment. Many of these pharmacists were also those who had absconded from military service in the late 1910s and so had no real loyalty to Germany or its people. At the same time, young prostitutes could also be ordered like a takeaway pizza. Pimps would place advertisements in newspapers and magazines. If you knew what you were looking for, the code was simple enough to crack. Then all you needed to do was phone the number given, and a telephone girl, which was a child between the ages of 12 to 17, would be delivered to your home or hotel room. Some telephone girls, almost always advertised as virgins, with their physical attributes hinted at through references to female movie stars, which is the identical method the MGM brothel used, which you can learn about on this channel, were often the most expensive prostitutes in all of Weimar Germany, with only rich businessmen or bankers or film stars able to afford their niche services and young ages. For many, the Kit Kat Club was the epicenter of Weimar-era Berlin. The club was arguably the city's leading entertainment venue and was made famous by Liza Minnelli in the hit musical Cabaret. But the Kit Kat Club was far from the only place Berliners could engage in degeneracy. By 1930, there were over 899 venues with a dancing license registered in the German capital. The Mocha FD nightclub, for example, was one of the crazier places in town. Now made famous again thanks to the popular Babylon Berlin books as well as the TV series, the venue was over the top with comfort. It had its own barber shop, pastry shop, and billiard hall. There was also a room of typists ready to take dictation for businessmen or journalists needing to take a break from their party to do some work. With individuals crammed in apartments and not enough housing to go around, the club was a nice place to spend a few hours. While there was no members-only brothel on site, it's believed that the Mocha FD was still a hotbed of prostitution, with many of the beautiful dancing girls and boys ready to go home with any clients. Other infamous Berlin venues of the time included the Haus Vaterland, a known hangout of gangsters as well as prostitutes, drug addicts, and bohemians. Haus Vaterland was known as a palace of pleasure, with the interiors modeled on everything from ancient Egypt to Moorish Spain via the Orient Express. Clients would spend whole days there. Supposedly, Haus Vaterland sold up to 25,000 cups of coffee in a single day, and Mocha in the Mocha FD Club refers to the many cups of coffee keeping Germans going. The German capital was a hotbed of organized crime, with corrupt politicians eager to take a kickback. Above all, the so-called Ringvereine, or ring clubs, ruled the roost. While these criminal gangs had existed since the end of the 19th century, they flourished in the interwar years, cashing in on the excesses and tragedy of the Weimar period, especially through their control of drugs, prostitution, and illegal pornography. Historians believe that as many as 60 Ringvereine operated in Berlin alone during the 1920s. These were largely made up of First World War veterans who sought work in city factories only to find none, as well as petty criminals and former convicts. However, the gangs also had a significant number of corrupt policemen on their payrolls. This insider help meant that they were often left to go about their illicit business unmolested. It was only really when the Nazis came to power that the authorities started clamping down on organized crime in Berlin. Up until that point, so long as the drugs kept coming and selling, the pornography kept being made available, and the backhanders were still being paid, little attention was paid to the city's gangsters by journalists and politicians alike. Supposedly, the Ringvereine honored a strict criminal code. While they operated protection rackets and fought to control the lucrative drugs trade, they never used violence against so-called civilians, only against fellow gangsters. This is a similar code to the Italian mob, which fell to feral street gangs and thugs due to various RICO actions in the 1990s. To keep the public on side, the criminal gangs of Germany also presented themselves as Robin Hood-type outlaws. They always gave a portion of their ill-gotten gains to poor mothers and children. This didn't convince the Nazis, however, who only had to look at the children pimped out to see the mob method wouldn't work. Berlin's decadent nightlife was hardly a secret at the time. The city authorities often engaged in the vice or benefited from it financially, and they were proud of the fact that their city was one of the most liberal, tolerant, and decadent places in the whole world. They embraced the reputation Berlin started to get at the beginning of the 1920s, and as the decade progressed, the scandalous underground scene became increasingly mainstream, with a major tourism industry growing up around it. Alongside the official Berlin Tourist Board advertisements, a large number of guidebooks offering visitors an insight into the racier parts of the city were published during the Weimar period. One of the most popular was Kurt Moreck's Guide Through Depraved Berlin of 1931, published in German. As the title suggests, this guidebook shunned the usual palaces and parks and instead pointed the curious visitor in the direction of gay bars like the Top, transvestite cabarets, and places that they could pick up a girl or boy for the night. Similarly, Ruth Marguerite Rowling wrote a popular guidebook to lesbian Berlin, advising readers that there was something for everyone in the city. Here, each can find their own happiness, for they make a point of satisfying every taste, she wrote. The economy of Berlin was human flesh. Even traditional guidebooks couldn't help mentioning the seedier side of the city, and while some warned visitors to stay away from the many dens of sin, this could have the opposite effect. By the mid-1920s, many were already complaining that the Berlin scene was over. Curious tourists were filling the tables of the main cabaret clubs, much to the annoyance of local artists and writers. Nevertheless, a true underground scene remained and thrived right until the start of the National Socialist government. The Mother Cat was the most famous and infamous spot for poor homosexuals. Here, beer cost just a few cents a glass, and off-duty soldiers mingled with manual laborers and bohemians keen to enjoy a different side to the city. In some, soldiers would sell their bodies for extra cash. In others, homosexual dalliances took place without any payment, as homosexual sex had been illegal in Germany since 1871. Word of mouth or coded newspaper advertisements at newspaper kiosks alerted the gay men of Berlin to new locations, much like Craigslist Backpage or the Instagram Tag Your Sponsor movement. There were also lesbian bars. Some venues were largely the preserve of upper-class ladies and their friends. The Dorian Gray, for example, was notoriously hard to get into, as was the El Dorado, which featured transvestite dancers. However, as with the men, women in the know knew where to go to find a working-class girl, who were almost always picked as they were deemed lower risk. Jeffrey Epstein used the same strategy for low-income Florida girls. For a short period, the Berlin club scene fell into bed with the Nazis. In February of 1934, Mocha FD hosted a special party to celebrate the first anniversary of the Nazi Party coming to power. According to the records, after a lavish banquet, the compere led the club's guests in toasting Hitler. Similarly, over at the El Dorado, the venue was closed and the owner handed the premises over to the Nazi SA. The once infamous venue became the headquarters of the Brown Shirts in Berlin. Hermann Göring, much more than Hitler himself, brought Berlin back to health. Within a matter of weeks of the Nazis coming to power, Göring as Reichsmarschall set up a citywide network to shut down brothels and review all newspapers for coded language. His experience in the health industry helped him review brothel records and find discrepancies, and there were many malfeasors to pursue. In February 1933, dozens of Berlin venues were forcibly closed down due to prostitution, drug dealing, public indecency, gay sex, assault, public drunkenness, and other charges. At the same time, gays and transvestites were arrested and thrown into prison for public indecency and solicitation. The Institute for Sexual Science was raided and its books were burned. Child prostitutes were rehomed and joined youth groups offered by the Nazi Party. Factories dedicated to aircraft and automobiles were funded by the government instead of brothels and cabarets. This brought unemployment down from 30% in 1933 to just 1% in 1938.